The air is heavy with silence, broken only by the soft murmur of voices inside the monastery. It is early morning on the island of Lindisfarne, a place of prayer and quiet devotion. The monks kneel together in dim candlelight, their chants rising and falling like waves, carrying a fragile sense of peace into the grey dawn. Outside, the sea is shrouded in mist so dense it swallows the horizon, blurring the line between water and sky. Even the gulls are quiet today. There is a strange stillness, the kind that presses against the skin and makes the heart uneasy, though no one yet knows why. Then, faintly at first, comes a sound, a low rhythmic pulse that doesn't belong to the sea or the wind, soft enough that it feels like a trick of the mind, but growing with each passing breath. Thump, thump, thump. The monks pause in their prayers, their voices faltering as ears strain to understand what is approaching through the fog. It is not the sound of oars. It is not the sound of who. It is deeper, more deliberate, like the heartbeat of some great unseen beast. A sense of dread creeps into the room. One monk slowly rises and moves to the narrow window slit. He peers out, but the fog is so thick it seems to cling to the land like a living thing. The sound grows louder, close, thump, 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 and then, through the shifting veil of grey, they appear. Dark shapes emerging like ghosts, solidifying into the unmistakable forms of ships, but not ordinary ships. Their prows are carved into the heads of dragons, open-mouthed and snarling as they slice through the water. Long, sleek vessels, silent except for the steady drumbeat that commands them. At first there are 2, then 4, then more, until the entire horizon is filled with moving shadows. The monk at the window steps back, his mouth opening in wordless horror. The others gather around him, confusion giving way to fear as the monstrous shapes draw nearer. From the mist, the first men appear. They stand in the boats like dark statues, motionless except for the wind rippling through their cloak. But as the ships beach themselves upon the sand, the stillness breaks. Men leap from the decks, splashing into the shallows with the force of a storm unleashed. Their eyes burn with a wild, unnatural intensity. Some are draped in bear pelts so massive they seem half-beast themselves. Others wear the skins of wolves, complete with snarling heads still attached, as if they have taken the spirit of the predator into their own flesh. Their faces are streaked with paint and scars carved deliberately into their skin, symbols of rituals no monk could comprehend. And then, the true terror begins. Some of the warriors drop to all fours like animals, snarling and foaming at the mouth. They bite the rims of their shields, teeth grinding wood into splinters as they howl in voices that are not entirely human. Their movements are jerky, almost convulsive, but charged with a frightening energy that no ordinary man could summon. Others move forward with a calm so deliberate it is even more unsettling. They smile wide, wolfish grins that promise not just violence but enjoyment in the taking of it. The monks have seen raiders before. They have seen men who kill for silver or grain, but these are not men who seek only plunder. There is something else in them, something deeper and darker that radiates through their very presence. Panic ripples through the monastery. A few monks try to run, their sandals slipping on the wet stones as they flee toward the chapel, clutching crosses in trembling hands. Others drop to their knees, praying aloud, desperate for a miracle that will not come. The raiders do not shout as they advance. There is no war cry, no warning, only the pounding of their feet on the earth, and the sound of shields cracking between their jaws. And then, the first scream shatters the air. It is over quickly. The doors are torn from their hinges. The sacred halls of prayer are flooded with violence. The monks' voices are drowned beneath the chaos as steel flashes in the dim light, as torches set to dry wood turn holy places into pits of flame. Yet even in the slaughter there is something unnerving, something beyond the simple brutality of war. The men in bare skins do not flinch at wood blades that would cripple another seem only to drive them forward harder. Blood runs freely down their arms and legs, yet they move as if untouched. The men in wolf skins are eerily precise, cutting down those who try to escape, stalking their prey with cold calculation. Between them they are a storm and a shadow, a force that feels less like an army, and more like an omen. When it is done, silence returns, but it is not the silence of prayer or peace. It is the hollow silence that follows ruin. Smoke coils upward into the mist, carrying with it the last traces of what was once sacred. The survivors, if any, will never forget what they have seen. For how can you forget the moment you realized you were not looking at men, but at something that walked the thin edge between human and beast? This was not just a raid, it was the opening of a wound that would never fully close. A wound that marked the beginning of what the world would come to call the Viking Age. And these warriors who seemed impervious to pain, who fought with a madness that shattered the courage of all who faced them. They were not just men, they were something more. Would you dare stand against them? Would you raise your blade against a creature that bleeds but does not fall, that howls like an animal yet strikes with the intelligence of a man? Or would you, like so many before you, simply run, knowing deep in your soul that nothing you do could stop what is coming? Because these were the berserkers, the wolf warriors, the terror that slipped through the fog to change the course of history forever. They were not just men, they were something more. They were spoken of in hushed tones, even among their own people. Two types of warriors who stood above the rest, not because they were stronger or faster in the way ordinary men could train to be, but because they seemed to step beyond what it meant to be human. The berserkers and the Ulfhedna. To outsiders, the difference between them was like the difference between a storm and a shadow. Both brought destruction, but in entirely different ways. Together they embodied the fearsome duality of the Viking mind: chaos and calculation, fury and precision. The berserkers were the embodiment of unrestrained violence. They fought with a frenzy that defied reason, charging into enemy lines with no armor, no hesitation, and seemingly no awareness of their own mortality. They howled like wild animals, their eyes glazed in a trance that made them impervious to fear. Many accounts described them biting their shields, gnawing the wood as though the act itself was a ritual to summon whatever force lived inside. They were said to swell with strength, faces flushed red, or darken to a near blue shade as if their very blood boiled. Some claimed they could uproot trees with their bare hands, others that neither blade nor fire could harm them in their state of battle madness. Was it human will that made them unstoppable, or something far more primal? In stark contrast, the Ulfhedna moved with eerie calm. Where the berserkers were the storm, these wolf warriors were the hunters in the night. They wore the pelts of wolves, their heads draped over their own so the snarling muzzle of the beast became their mask. They fought not in chaotic rages but with cold, calculated precision, often working in silent coordination like a pack circling prey. Witnesses spoke of how they appeared from nowhere, striking at vulnerable points with terrifying efficiency before melting back into the shadows. If a berserker broke the enemy's courage with overwhelming force, an Ulfhedna shredded it quietly, piece by piece, until all that was left was fear. What made them so feared was not only how they fought but what they represented. They blurred the boundary between man and animal. On the battlefield you were not facing a soldier who valued his life, who would feel pain, who could be reasoned with. You were facing something that moved with the instincts of a beast and the intelligence of a man. How do you fight someone who doesn't care if they live or die? How do you defend yourself against a creature that seems to see you not as an opponent but as The rituals that created such men were as terrifying as the warriors themselves. Sagas tell of berserkers entering a trance-like state before battle, their breathing slow and rhythmic, their eyes fixed on some unseen point, as if communing with a power beyond mortal comprehension. Then, suddenly, the stillness would erupt into uncontrollable shaking, snarling, and howling. They would foam at the mouth and lash out at anyone nearby, friend or foe, until finally they were released into the fight, like caged animals freed. The Ulfhedna followed a different path. They were said to undergo rituals of isolation, spending days or weeks in the wilderness, living as wolves to learn their ways. They would mimic the movements and calls of the animal, until they no longer moved like men. Some claimed they could even understand the language of wolves, calling them into battle, or guiding them in hunts. The fear these warriors inspired was magnified by the belief that they were touched by the gods themselves. Berserkers were often linked to Odin, the god of frenzy, death, and wisdom. In the Old Norse worldview, to be possessed by Odin was not madness. It was a gift. It gave you access to strength beyond flesh, vision beyond human sight, and fearlessness in the face of death. The Ulfidnar were also tied to Odin, but through his wolf companions, Geri and Freki. To wear the skin of a wolf was to take on its spirit, to embody its cunning and predatory nature. To the enemies of the Vikings, monks, peasants, even seasoned warriors, it was easier to believe these men were possessed than to accept they were human. And perhaps that belief was part of the weapon. Imagine standing in a shield wall, gripping your spear, heart pounding as the enemy approaches. You expect men, soldiers like yourself. Instead, you see figures draped in animal skins, their teeth bared, their howls echoing across the field like the cries of something not entirely mortal. You see one throw down his shield and bite into it until blood runs down his chin. You see another creeping along the edges of the battle, moving low and silent, watching you with the eyes of a predator. In that moment, your mind begins to fracture. Fear eats at you before the first blow is even struck. Even centuries later, when the sagas were written, these warriors were described with a mixture of awe and horror. They were both honored and feared within their own society, respected for their power yet kept at a distance for their unpredictability. Archaeological finds support their existence. Images on helmet plates showing men in animal skins, runestones depicting figures in wolf masks, graves containing weapons and animal remains buried together. There is no doubt they were real. The only question is how far their transformation truly went. Were they simply men conditioned to embrace a terrifying state of mind, or did they truly step into the realm of the supernatural, as their enemies believed? The answer perhaps lies somewhere in between. They were flesh and blood, yes, but they were also something else, proof of how far the human mind can be pushed, proof of how culture, belief and ritual can turn a man into something that feels beyond human. Whether you called it frenzy or possession, whether you believed in gods or only in psychology, one truth remained. When a berserker or Ulfidnar came for you, you were not facing a mere man, you were facing the storm or the shadow, and in either case you were already lost. From the moment they could walk, the path of the Viking warrior was carved into them. Childhood was not a time of softness or play, it was a crucible. Boys were thrown into the cold long before their bodies were ready. They were made to swim in icy waters that burned the lungs and numbed the limbs. Not for sport, but to strip away hesitation. They were left to sit in snowdrifts until their skin turned raw, taught that the body's protests were only illusions to be conquered. Hunger was not a misfortune but a lesson. Cold was not an enemy but a teacher. Pain was not avoided but embraced, transformed into proof that they were moving closer to something beyond the reach of ordinary men. Endurance was the first threshold, but it was only the beginning. To become something more, the mind had to be reshaped just as ruthlessly as the body. Young initiates were pulled away from their families and thrust into isolation. In the dark silence of the forest, they learned what it felt like to be truly alone, to feel the weight of the world's indifference. The nights stretched long, filled with strange sounds, the cries of animals, the whisper of the wind through skeletal branches. There in that solitude, the human mind began to slip. You stop thinking like a boy, you stop thinking like a man, something else takes root. They were taught to mimic the animals they would one day embody. Berserker initiates learned the slow, heavy movements of the bear, the way it stood, the way it roared, the raw power in its stillness. The wolf warriors learned to stalk silently, to move without sound, to watch before striking. They practiced the howls, the growls, the snarls, repeating them until they no longer felt like play acting but instinct. The line between man and beast began to blur, not just in their movements but in their mind. Imagine crawling on all fours in the darkness for hours until your thoughts stop sounding like words and begin to feel like pure sensation. Imagine holding that state so long that when you return to your feet, the ground still feels alien beneath you. But this was not simply mimicry, it was ritual. In the Old Norse world, the barrier between the human and the animal, the living and the spiritual, was thin. The gods themselves were shapeshifters. Odin could send his spirit into the form of a wolf or a raven, his body left behind like an empty shell. To the warriors who worshipped him, this was not myth but instruction. Through trance, through deprivation, through deliberate breaking of the self, they sought to step beyond the human form and become a vessel for something more. Shamans guided them with chants and drums, pounding rhythms designed to push the mind into altered states. In those moments reality slipped. Some said they saw visions, that they felt the presence of the bear or the wolf standing beside them, entering them, merging with them. Was it spiritual, or was it the human brain reaching the edges of its own perception? Those who passed through these initiations were changed. Even when they returned to their villages, they were no longer quite the same. There was a look in their eyes, a quietness that was not peace, but something deeper, something watchful. Their movements became different, less hesitant, more instinctive, as if some part of them remained in the forest, even when their bodies were home. And when the time for battle came, they did not have to pretend to be animals. They called on the state they had cultivated in silence, and it came to them like an old friend. The trance was the final piece of their transformation. Before a raid or a great battle, the warriors would gather in a circle. Some would chant, low and guttural, repeating the same sounds until they lost all meaning. Others would sway back and forth in rhythm, their breathing deep and controlled. Slowly the ordinary world would fall away. Muscles would tense, faces would flush, hands would tremble. Then, suddenly the change would take hold. A scream would tear from someone's throat, high and sharp like an animal's cry. Another would throw himself to the ground, clawing at the earth, as if trying to dig through it. Teeth sank into shields, tearing wood into shreds. What you saw in that moment was no longer a man preparing for combat. It was something unbound, something primal and raw. Did they truly believe they were possessed, or had they simply learned to unlock parts of themselves the rest of us keep buried? It's difficult to say. To a Christian monk watching from a monastery wall, it must have seemed like pure demonic madness. To the warriors themselves, it was a gift from Odin, a blessing that made them fearless, untouchable, more than flesh and bone. Modern minds might call it extreme psychological conditioning, the body's own adrenaline and endorphins taken to an art form. But even if you strip away the myths, you are left with the same undeniable truth. They became something most of us cannot even imagine, and that is what made them so terrifying. Not that they were born different, but that they made themselves different. They chose to shed the skin of ordinary humanity and step into a place where pain, fear, and hesitation no longer had meaning. They did not merely train their body, they trained their minds to believe they were no longer men. And once you believe that fully, completely, who can stand against you? So you have to ask yourself, what would it take for you to give up the last pieces of who you are? Could you crawl into the forest as a man and return as something else entirely? Could you embrace the darkness within yourself so deeply that it no longer feels dark, only necessary? For the berserkers and the Ulfhedna, the answer was yes. They became more than human, or perhaps less. They became the storm and the shadow. Imagine standing across from a man whose face is flushed red, his breathing deep and ragged, his muscles trembling as if about to tear themselves apart. He grips his shield not as protection, but as prey, sinking his teeth into the rim, until splinters of wood snap between his jaws. His eyes are wide, unfocused and yet burning with an intensity that feels alien. He shudders violently, a guttural sound rising from deep within his chest, and then with a scream that doesn't sound entirely human, he charges. Wounds that would stop any ordinary man, slashes across the arms, spears piercing the side, do nothing. He doesn't slow, he doesn't even seem to notice. That was the reality of the berserker's rage. A state so extreme it blurred the line between invincibility and madness. How was it possible? How could a man bite through wood like an animal, fight on despite bleeding heavily, and terrify seasoned warriors, simply by existing in this frenzy? For centuries the simplest explanation was that they were possessed. The Norse believed Odin, the god of battle frenzy, filled their bodies with a force beyond mortal limits. But even if you set the mythology aside, you're left with an undeniable question. What was happening inside them to make this transformation real? One theory suggests they deliberately used nature's own chemistry. Throughout Scandinavia, a red-capped mushroom known as Amanita muscaria grew in abundance. Its striking white spotted surface hides a complex mix of toxins that can alter perception, dull pain, and induce a dreamlike dissociation from reality. Ethnobotanists have traced its use in shamanic rituals across Siberia and northern Europe, where it was believed to open doors between worlds. A berserker who consumed it before battle might experience surges of strength, a distorted sense of time, and a numbing of pain. But mushrooms like this can also cause confusion, nausea, and clumsy movements, which hardly matches the deadly precision described in the saga. Was this truly their secret, or just part of a larger puzzle? Others point to henbane, a plant known in Viking Age Scandinavia that produces a more controlled delirium, lowering fear and heightening aggression. Archaeological digs have uncovered henbane seeds at Viking sites, suggesting it was used intentionally. Taken in careful doses, it could reduce the sensation of pain while sharpening a single obsessive focus, perfect for warriors seeking to leave their humanity behind for the duration of a battle. And then there is alcohol, strong mead consumed ritually, perhaps mixed with herbs to amplify its effects. Alone it could not explain the supernatural resilience, but combined with other techniques, it may have been enough to push them past ordinary human thresholds. Yet even these pharmacological answers feel incomplete. The berserker rage was not random intoxication. It was a controlled state, one they could summon at will. That suggests something deeper. Intense psychological conditioning. Modern science knows that under extreme stress, the brain can do extraordinary things. Adrenaline floods the bloodstream, sharpening reflexes and numbing pain. Endorphins act like natural morphine, dulling injuries that would incapacitate others. In life or death situations, soldiers and athletes have reported moments of impossible strength, lifting weights far beyond their normal capacity, running through injuries without realizing it, surviving wounds they should not have endured. Could the berserkers have learned to trigger this state deliberately? It is possible. They trained from childhood to embrace pain, fear, and exhaustion. They practiced ritualized breathing and rhythmic movement, which are known to influence the nervous system. They prepared their minds through isolation, trance, and belief. When battle came, they were not entering an unknown state. They were stepping into a place they had rehearsed over and over, until it became second nature. Modern neuroscience calls this dissociation a temporary shutting down of the parts of the brain responsible for self-awareness and hesitation. In that moment, you no longer feel like you. You stop thinking about the risk of death, and your body simply acts. For the berserkers, this was not an accident, it was the goal. Consider how powerful belief itself can be. To a Norse warrior, the berserker's state was not merely physical, it was spiritual. They believed that when the frenzy came, it was Odin himself filling their bodies, guiding their blows, making them untouchable. And when the mind fully accepts that something greater has taken over, it stops resisting, fear disappears, pain loses meaning. In the same way that modern placebo effects can trigger real physiological changes, their faith may have amplified the state until it became almost supernatural. So which was it? Was the berserker rage a drug-fueled delirium, a psychological technique honed to perfection, or a genuine brush with the divine? The truth may lie in the combination. A ritual drink laced with herbs could loosen the boundaries of conscious breathing patterns, and chanting could push the mind into trance. Deeply rooted belief would carry it over the final threshold. Layered together, these elements created something that felt like possession, because in every way that mattered, it. And if you think such a state is impossible, look at modern extremes. Soldiers in combat zones have reported fighting for hours without realizing they'd been wounded. Athletes have broken records while barely remembering the event, lost in what psychologists call the flow state. People in moments of crisis have lifted cars off loved ones, driven purely by adrenaline. If that is what the human body can do accidentally, Imagine what could be achieved by a culture that deliberately sought to unlock it. The berserkers knew how to reach that threshold. They made their rage into a weapon, harnessing the body's hidden reserves, while silencing the part of the mind that would hold back. To their enemies, it was magic. To themselves, it was sacred. To us, it stands as a reminder of what lies dormant in all of us. The capacity to push far beyond what we think is possible when fear is stripped away. So were they truly more than men, or just men who learned to open a door the rest of us keep locked? In the haze of history, it's hard to say, but what we know is this. When a berserker entered that state, nothing, not steel, not fire, not the screams of the dying, could reach them. They became the storm incarnate, and no one could stand in its path. They were not the storm, they were the silence before it. While the berserkers roared through enemy lines with unstoppable force, the Ulfhedna crept like shadows, patient and deliberate. They were the wolf warriors, men who studied not only how to fight, but how to stalk, how to watch, how to wait for the precise moment when fear would do half the killing for them. To face a berserker was to face chaos. To face an Ulfhedn was to feel the weight of being hunted. These warriors lived and fought like wolves. They trained to move through forests without leaving a trace, to disappear into the terrain, and to use darkness as their ally. They would approach in silence, circling a camp like a pack, testing its prey. When they struck, it was never head-on. They chose the vulnerable, the isolated, the ones already breaking under the strain of anticipation. They howled in the night, not to give away their position, but to sow confusion. Was it a wolf? Was it a man? Was it one of them or many? That uncertainty gnawed at the mind. By the time the first blade found its target, fear had already weakened the will to resist. What made their approach so terrifying was not just their stealth, but their coordination. Like wolves, they were never alert. They used howls as signals, short, sharp calls that sounded like wild animals, but carried meaning to those who understood them. A single howl could mean regroup, a rising call could mean flank. To their enemies, it sounded like the forest itself was alive with predators. You could be surrounded and never know it until the moment the attack began. And once they struck, they didn't linger. They hit hard and then vanished, leaving behind only blood and the echo of their howls, as if to remind survivors that the hunt was not finished. The Ulfhedna drew their identity from Odin in a different way than berserkers. Where the berserker embodied Odin's frenzy and ecstasy, the wolf warrior channeled his cunning and his quiet mastery of death. Odin was the god who walked between worlds, who sent his wolves Geri and Freki to scout and devour. To wear the wolf's pelt was to call on its spirit, to see through its eyes and think with its instinct. The warriors underwent rituals to strip away their human habits and take on the animal's nature. Some lived apart from their communities, surviving off the land as a wolf would, until the line between man and beast blurred in both thought and movement. Imagine the effect on those they hunted. You are a Saxon soldier guarding a border, posted in the woods at dusk. The trees stretch endlessly around you, and the wind carries faint sounds you can't quite place. Then you hear it. A howl, distant but not far enough. You tell yourself it's just a... Then another answers from a different direction, and another. Your grip tightens on your spear. Your heartbeat quickens. You strain your eyes, but the underbrush shows nothing. Minutes feel like hours. The silence after the howls is worse than the sound itself, because now you know something is watching. When the attack comes, it is sudden and precise. By the time you turn, the warrior is already gone, melting back into the forest before you can even cry for help. That is the difference between the storm and the shadow. Berserkers broke enemy lines with brute force, overwhelming the senses so completely that resistance collapsed. Ulfhedna broke them from the inside out, unraveling courage with dread long before the blade arrived. One was visible and unstoppable, the other was invisible and inevitable. Together they were two faces of the same terror, chaos and calculation, rage and restraint. The sagas describe how Ulfhedna would fight in pairs or small groups, always moving like a They did not rely on shields, preferring speed and agility. They fought in close quarters, slipping behind enemy lines and striking where formations were weakest. And when the frenzy of battle began to die down, They hunted the fleeing, ensuring that no survivor would ever feel safe again. They didn't just kill bodies, they killed the spirit to resist. Even among the Vikings, these warriors stood apart. Berserkers were feared, but they were also celebrated for their sheer force. Ulfidna inspired a quieter, more enduring unease. They were not men you wanted in your hall for long. They spoke little, their eyes distant as if they still saw through the wolf's gaze. Yet their value was undeniable. Kings kept them close as scouts, assassins and bodyguards, silent blades to deal with enemies who needed to vanish without warning. Were they truly part wolf? No, not in flesh, but in mind. They were closer to the predator than the human. Through ritual, isolation and belief, they stepped outside the boundaries of normal thought and embraced a different way of being. And perhaps that is what made them so effective. They stopped seeing themselves as individuals and became something collective, instinctive. They didn't fight for glory, they fought because the hunt was its own purpose. To the people who lived in fear of Viking raids, it almost didn't matter how they achieved this. What mattered was the experience of it. The eerie howls in the distance, the sudden flash of movement in the dark, the realization that someone was tracking you long before you ever saw them. That is the essence of true dread. Not the enemy you see, but the one you feel around you everywhere, even when the forest appears empty. So ask yourself this: would you rather face the storm head-on, knowing at least where it comes from, or the shadow that moves unseen, patient and calculating? Berserkers could be met in open battle. Ulfidna could not. They were the hunters, and everyone else was prey. Egil Skallagrimsson was born into a family where fury was more than a temperament. It was a legacy. From his earliest days he was marked as different. In the sagas he is described as a dark, brooding child, with features that seemed carved from shadow, coarse hair, a heavy brow, and eyes that held an unsettling intensity. He did not laugh like other children. He did not play gently, even at an age when most boys still clung to their mothers. Egil's presence carried a weight that made people uneasy, and by the time he was 7 years old, that unease turned to fear. It happened during a simple ball game, one of the few times when boys were allowed to release their energy freely. The rules didn't matter, what mattered was the thrill of competition. Egil was smaller than the older boys, but he had no patience for losing. When one boy mocked him, perhaps shoving him harder than necessary, Egil didn't sulk or walk away. He went home, retrieved an axe, returned to the game, and drove the blade into the boy's skull. At 7 years old, he killed without hesitation, and when he stood over the body, there was no remorse in his eyes. Instead, he looked at the others as if daring them to speak. His mother, far from shocked, reportedly praised him. She told him he had the spirit of a true Viking, the strength to take what he wanted without fear. From that moment on, Egil's path was sealed. But even among the violent world of the Vikings, Egil stood apart. His father, Skallagrim, was a berserker known for his uncontrollable rages. And yet Egil challenged him. One saga recounts a chilling scene. During a game of ball, Skallagrim's fury turned on one of Egil's playmates, killing him in a fit of berserker strength. Most children would have cowered. But Egil picked up an axe and struck his own father in the shoulder, wounding him deep. He was a boy willing to raise his hand against the very man who gave him life, driven by a sense of vengeance, and a refusal to submit to anyone's power, not even a father feared by all. That act was more than defiant. It was a glimpse into the complex man Egil would become, one who would honor loyalty fiercely, but repay betrayal without mercy. As he grew, Egil's reputation spread like wildfire. He was not only a warrior but a man touched by something almost unnatural. In battle he became a storm of violence. His berserker rage was unlike anything others had seen. One story tells of a desperate moment when his comrades were surrounded, the enemy pressing in with overwhelming numbers. It was hopeless, and yet Egil his face swelled, his eyes turned pale and cold, and his movements blurred into something more than human. He tore through the shield wall alone, killing so many that the enemy's morale collapsed. That single frenzy saved dozens of lives and turned a certain defeat into victory. What does it say about a man when his rage can alter the course of a battle? And yet there was another side to Eagle. Beneath the brute strength and terrifying unpredictability lay a mind of rare intelligence. He was a poet, a skald, whose verses could pierce as sharply as his axe. In Viking society this was not a contradiction, but a power. A warrior who could immortalize his own deeds in poetry held a kind of double strength on the battlefield and in the memory of his people. Eagle began composing poetry as a child, his words laced with the same fierce intensity that drove his hands in combat. His sagas tell us that his poems carried weight, capable of stirring warriors' hearts or shaming. This duality, murderer and poet, savage and scholar, made him deeply unpredictable. He could kill without blinking, yet also create words that lingered for generations. Perhaps the most extraordinary proof of this came when his life hung by a thread. After a long and bloody feud with King Eric Bloodaxe of Norway, Eagle was captured. By all accounts, his execution was certain. He had killed the king's men, humiliated his rule, and even slain Eric's son. Yet in the cold, dark cell where he awaited death, Eagle composed a poem, not just any poem, but a masterwork of praise so moving, so expertly crafted, that when he recited it before the king, Eric could not bring himself to execute him. A man who had slaughtered without hesitation was spared by the power of his own words. How do you reconcile such a person? Was he a monster who wrapped himself in art to disguise his brutality, or a deeply human soul who simply lived by the only rules his world understood? The sagas do not give simple answers. They show us a man who could be both cruel and noble, both violent and reflective. He avenged friends and destroyed enemies with equal fervor. He was loyal to those who earned it, and merciless to those who didn't. In many ways, Eagle embodied the extremes of Viking culture, the raw physicality of the berserker and the refined wisdom of the poet, and perhaps that is why his story still echoes. He forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that greatness and horror can live in the same person, that the same mind capable of shaping beauty can also unleash destruction. Would you admire him for his courage, his artistry, his defiance of kings? Or would you fear him for his temper, his unpredictability, his readiness to kill even as a child? Egil Skallagrimsson lived well into old age, a rarity for a man of his kind. By the time his body weakened, his legend had already taken on a life of its own. Even blind and frail, he was said to carry himself with the same unyielding pride he had as a youth. And when he finally passed, the people spoke of him in tones that mixed awe with unease. Was he a hero or a cur, a poet or a killer? Or was he, like the berserkers themselves, simply a reminder of what humans are capable of when they step beyond the boundaries of ordinary life? In Egil's life, we see that the most terrifying warriors were not just those who could kill, they were those who could shape the world around them, in blood and in words, leaving behind a story so haunting it refuses to die. Harald Sigurdsson, known to history as Harald Hardrada, the Hard Ruler, was born into a world already carved by blood and ambition. He was not content to simply follow the paths laid out before him. From the moment he could hold a weapon, he stood apart, a boy whose sharp mind matched his physical ferocity. At only 15 years old, he was already in battle, standing beside his half-brother King Olaf II of Norway at the fateful clash of Stiklestad. The fight was brutal and hopelessly uneven, and Olaf fell beneath a storm of enemy blades. Harald himself was cut down, his body left broken on the field, but unlike so many others, he refused to die there. Wounded and hunted, he escaped into exile, already carrying within him the spark of something greater, a relentless will that would never yield. His exile led him eastward to the courts of Kievan Rus, where he recovered and began rebuilding his strength. But Harald was not a man who could remain in anyone's shadow for long. The stories say he was tall even by Norse standards, with piercing eyes and a presence that drew attention whether you welcomed it or not. Soon he set his sights further to the shining city of Constantinople, where the Byzantine Empire's legendary Varangian Guard awaited him. It was there that Harald truly became something more than just a wandering Viking warrior. The Varangian Guard was no ordinary unit. They were the Emperor's personal bodyguards, an elite force drawn from the toughest Norse and Rus fight, and within that circle of hardened men, Harold rose to the top. Byzantine chronicles describe him as both cunning and disciplined, mastering not only the ferocity of Viking warfare but also the tactical precision of one of the most advanced militaries in the world. He fought in Sicily, in the Holy Land, across the vast Mediterranean, leading men into battles far from the frozen north. Unlike berserkers who relied on sheer frenzy, Harold combined cold calculation with explosive force, making him both feared and respected. One of his most infamous acts came during a siege in Sicily. The city resisted every assault, its high walls impossible to breach. But Harold saw a weakness others missed. Birds nested within the settlement, flying in and out over the rampart. He ordered his men to capture the birds, tie small burning materials to their backs, and release them. The birds returned to their nests, carrying fire into the heart of the city. In moments, flames spread uncontrollably, and the defenders were forced to surrender. It was a trick both cruel and ingenious, showing how Harold's mind worked, always looking for the solution no one else would consider. He did not fight like a simple Viking raider. He fought like a predator that studied its prey before striking. During his years in Byzantine service, he grew immensely wealthy and even more experienced. He learned siegecraft, naval warfare, and the intricacies of politics. By the time he returned north, he was not just a warrior, he was a commander forged by the world's greatest empire. And when he finally returned to Norway, it was not as an exile but as a man determined to claim the throne. He became king, ruling with the same relentless drive he showed on the battlefield. Yet even as a ruler, Harold was never satisfied. He waged war on Denmark for 17 years, never tiring, never retreating. His ambition seemed endless, but his greatest and final campaign would come in 166 when he turned his eyes toward England. Harold claimed the English throne as his right, and he arrived with a massive fleet, 300 ships carrying thousands of warriors. His initial victories were swift and devastating. At Fulford, his army crushed the English forces sent to oppose him, showing the same precision and power that had defined his entire life. For a brief moment it seemed as if nothing could stop him. Then came Stamford Bridge. King Harold Godwinson of England marched his army north with astonishing speed, catching Harold's forces off guard. Many of his men had left their armor at the ships, expecting only to collect hostages and tribute. But Harold did not panic. When the English arrived, he rallied his men with calm determination. Accounts say he fought with the fury of a berserker in those final hours, wielding his great two-handed axe and cutting down all who approached. Even the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written by his enemies, described his bravery in awe. Wherever he struck, the English line broke. His strength seemed inexhaustible, his will unshaken even as the battle turned against him. But even Harold Hardrada was still mortal. In the chaos, an arrow struck him in the throat, ending his life on the field. His death marked not only the end of his own saga, but also the end of the Viking Age. With Harold's fall, the old way of the Viking warrior faded into history, replaced by the new order of kings and kingdoms that would dominate Europe. What makes Harold's story so compelling is how he embodied the evolution of the Viking spirit. He was not just a raider or a berserker, he was the culmination of everything the Norse warrior ideal could become. He could fight with unmatched ferocity, but he also understood strategy, diplomacy, and the value of intellect. He could burn a city to the ground with a clever trick, then lead men in close combat with the strength of 10. He was ruthless but also disciplined, ambitious yet calculating. And yet his life ended the same way as so many before him, in blood, on the battlefield, surrounded by the sounds of dying men. Does that make his journey tragic, or inevitable? Perhaps both. Harold Hardrada was too large to fit quietly into the world that was emerging. He belonged to an age of warriors who shaped history with their own hands, an age that was already fading. His legend forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Was he a hero, or just a man who learned to play the game of power better than anyone else? Was his brilliance a sign of evolution, or simply a sharper edge on the same blade of violence that had always driven Viking ambition? What is clear is that Harold was more than a man. He was an era in human form, a living embodiment of what it meant to take the Viking way of life to its ultimate limit. Even in death, his shadow lingered, He remains one of the most remembered figures of that time, his name etched in both Norse sagas and Byzantine chronicles. And when you look at his life, you see not just a warrior, but the full arc of a world changing. Harald Hardrada was the last great Viking, the ultimate expression of what they could be, and the final proof that even the fiercest warrior cannot fight time itself. Thorkel the Tall was a man who carried the weight of legend, even while he lived. Towering above most warriors of his time, he was said to have a presence that unsettled enemies before a single sword was drawn. But it was not just his size that made him fearsome, it was what he represented. Thorkel was the leader of the Jomsvikings, an elite brotherhood, whose very existence blurred the line between myth and reality. They were more than just raiders or mercenaries, they were a cult of warriors bound by a code so strict it turned men into weapons. Within their walls at Jomsborg, only the strongest were accepted. Candidates had to prove their worth in combat, endure impossible trials, and swear oaths to never retreat, never show fear, and never break their word to their brothers. To fail was to die. To belong was to become part of something larger than yourself. Imagine the effect this had on their enemies. Ordinary Vikings fought for gold, land, or vengeance, but the Jomsvikings fought for something colder, sharper, a creed that stripped away hesitation. They did not fear death, because their code left no room for fear. They did not break, because retreat was forbidden. And at their head stood Thorkel, the embodiment of everything their order stood for. When he led them into battle, they moved like a single organism, disciplined, yet terrifyingly aggressive. Villages burned, armies scattered, and even kings hesitated when they heard the name Thorkel. Thorkel's career began with the brutal raids that made the Jomsvikings infamous. They struck coastal towns with ruthless efficiency, taking what they wanted and leaving nothing but ashes. But unlike the wild berserkers, their violence was controlled, calculated. They fought in formations, used tactics honed through relentless training, and wielded fear as a weapon long before the first blade fell. It is said that entire armies would surrender simply upon learning the Jomsvikings were coming. That was the power of their reputation, and it was Thorkel who shaped it. Yet Thorkel was more than a raider. He was also a strategist who understood the shifting tides of power in a world where alliances were as fragile as the next battle. His story took an unexpected turn when he sailed to England. At first he led Viking forces against the English, raiding the coast and crushing defenders. But then in a twist that startled even his own men, he switched sides. He offered his services to King Ethelred of England, taking payment to defend the same land he had just ravaged. Some called it betrayal, others called it pragmatism. Thorkel understood that loyalty in his world was not to nations but to survival, to opportunity and to the bonds of his brotherhood. Under the English king, Thorkel fought with the same ferocity he had shown as an invader. His men became protectors rather than raiders, guarding the very people who had once feared them. And yet, when the tides shifted again, he returned to serve Cnut the Great, the Viking king who would rule over England itself. To some, this made Thorkel a mercenary, a man without true allegiance. But to those who understood him, it revealed something deeper. Thorkel was loyal only to the code of the warrior. His service was not about politics or borders, it was about the brotherhood of fighters who lived and died by the same blade. What made him unforgettable was not just his adaptability but his sheer presence on the battlefield. Chronicles tell of how his arrival could turn the tide of a fight. He was a giant, wielding a massive axe that few could even lift, cutting down men as if they were nothing more than saplings in his path. But more terrifying than his strength was his calm. While others screamed and raged, Thorkel fought with a cold, methodical precision. He did not need to roar to inspire fear. He simply was fear, moving through the chaos with deliberate purpose. The Jomsvikings under his command shared this same unnerving composure. They did not break formation, did not panic, and did not retreat. Even when surrounded, they fought as if retreat was not an option, because in truth, it wasn't. Their code bound them as tightly as chains. And so against Thorkel and his men, enemies faced not just warriors but an idea, a brotherhood so absolute it removed every weakness that fear or hesitation could bring. And yet, there was humanity in Thorkel, though it rarely showed. The sagas tell of moments when he spared enemies, of times when his decisions were guided not by rage but by a strange kind of honor. He was not reckless, he was not cruel for the sake of cruelty. He understood power, and he understood the cost of it. In a time when loyalty was often bought with silver and broken with the next offer, Thorkel remained consistent in one thing: his belief in the warrior's path. Eventually, like all great figures, his story faded into the shifting politics of his age. He returned to Denmark, serving as a trusted advisor to Knut, and maintaining his influence until his later years. Unlike many of his peers, he did not die in some desperate last stand. He lived long enough to see the Viking world change, to see the age of raids give way to the age of king. But his name never lost its weight. In England, in Denmark, across the North Sea, the memory of Thorkel the Tall lingered. What makes Thorkel's story compelling is how it reveals the many faces of a Viking warrior. He was a raider, yes, but also a protector, a mercenary, but also a man of unshakable discipline. He could burn a town one year and defend it the next, not out of treachery, but because he saw beyond the simple lines others drew between friend and foe. He understood that power was fluid, that survival belonged to those who could bend with the tide, yet never break their core. The question his life raises is unsettling. Can fear itself be a weapon greater than any blade? For Thorkel it was. His enemies feared not just his strength, but the inevitability he carried with him. To face Thorkel was to face the certainty that you could not win, because he and his brothers would not stop, and in a way that made him more terrifying than any lone berserker. Thorkel the Tall was not just a man, he was a symbol of what happens when discipline and brutality meet. When a warrior's code becomes sharper than any sword. He did not roar like the berserkers or stalk like the Ulfhednar, but his shadow stretched just as far. He led an elite brotherhood that turned fear into a language spoken long before the battle even began, and even now his name carries the echo of that promise, that sometimes the most frightening thing is not the battle you fight, but the knowledge that it is already lost. Fear was the Vikings' most potent weapon, sharpened not just through violence, but through the careful crafting of an image. Long before a blade was drawn, they had begun to win the battle in the minds of their enemy. Imagine being a Saxon farmer, standing at the edge of your village when the horizon suddenly filled with dragon-headed ships. The prows cut through the fog like creatures from another world. Even before you saw the men aboard, you heard them, the deep, rhythmic beat of war drums, the distant howls that sounded neither fully human nor entirely animal. By the time the first warrior stepped onto shore, you were already trembling. Berserkers understood that appearance was as powerful as steel. They covered themselves in bear pelts, wolf skins, and dark paint that hid their human features and replaced them with something primal. Their faces were streaked with soot and blood, their hair wild, their eyes wide with an unblinking intensity that made them seem more like beasts than men. When they entered their battle frenzy, they bit their shields, foamed at the mouth, and screamed with a pitch that cut through the It wasn't just noise, it was theatre, deliberate and calculated to create terror before the first strike. Chronicles from the time are filled with accounts of panic spreading faster than the warriors themselves. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes villages abandoned at the mere rumour of a Viking raid. Farmers left their fields, soldiers deserted their posts, and entire regions offered tribute rather than risk facing them in open battle. Frankish annals tell of men fleeing at the sight of warriors who seemed impervious to wounds, believing they were possessed by pagan gods. To the Christians of Europe, the Vikings were not just foreign invaders. They were an unstoppable, almost supernatural force, and the Vikings knew that. They fed the fear by exaggerating their rituals, by carrying with them songs and stories of their own invincibility, by ensuring that those who escaped to tell the tale spoke not just of bloodshed, but of something far worse, the feeling that they were fighting creatures beyond reason. Psychological warfare shaped the Vikings' success more than sheer numbers ever could. A berserker charge was devastating not only because of its force, but because it shattered morale. Soldiers trained to hold a shield wall found their courage collapsing as a frothing, shield-biting figure rushed toward them without fear of death. How do you fight someone who does not care if they live or die? That thought alone could break a line before a single sword touched. Fear is contagious. One man falters, then another, until even the bravest realize they are standing alone. This mastery of fear went beyond the berserkers. The Ulfhedna, the wolf warriors, used sound as a weapon. They howled in the darkness, circling camps like predators waiting to strike. To the soldiers inside, those howls told a story more powerful than any weapon could, of being watched, of being surrounded, of being prey. By the time the attack came, many defenders were already half defeated, their minds consumed with the thought of what was waiting just beyond the torchlight. Even the raids themselves were psychological campaigns. The Vikings did not strike randomly. They chose targets that would send a message. Monasteries were perfect victims. They were wealthy yet poorly defended, and their destruction carried spiritual weight. To burn a monastery was not just to take gold. It was to make people believe their god could not protect them. News of these raids spread like wildfire, carried by terrified survivors whose words made the Vikings seem larger, stronger, and more numerous than they really were. This use of fear created a feedback loop. The more terrifying their reputation became, the easier it was to win battles without fighting. Tribute was paid without resistance. Cities surrendered before the siege. Armies broke before the first clash. In a sense, the Vikings weaponized the human imagination. They understood that the mind will often create horrors worse than reality. If you can make your enemy believe you cannot be beaten, half the war is already won. Modern historians and psychologists recognize this as a sophisticated form of psychological warfare. Today we call it intimidation, but to the people of the 9th and 10th centuries it felt like facing the end of the world. And in that sense, the Vikings were not just warriors but masters of manipulation. They knew how to turn every part of themselves, appearance, sound, movement, into tools of fear. Even the smallest detail, like painting their shields with monstrous faces, added another layer to the terror. It's easy to look back now and see them only as brutal raiders, but their success wasn't just brute force, it was deliberate. They understood the fragile nature of human courage. They knew that if you could make a man doubt, if you could make him feel the fight was already lost, you didn't need to kill him. You just needed to let his own fear do the work. That is why so many accounts describe enemies running before the first strike, surrendering entire towns and fortresses without resistance. So when we talk about the terrifying nature of Viking warriors, it isn't just about the blood they spilled, it's about how they reached into the minds of their enemies and planted something far more powerful than a wound. They made people believe they were facing more than men. And once you believe that, you stop seeing the possibility of victory. You start to accept defeat before the battle even begins. Would you have stood your ground as those longships appeared through the mist? Would you have held your spear steady when a berserker locked eyes with you, grinning through blood-streaked teeth? Or would you, like so many before, have felt the chill of inevitability and run? In the end, the Vikings understood a truth that still holds today. The greatest victories are won not on the battlefield, but in the mind. They seemed invincible once, these men who blurred the line between human and beast. For generations, berserkers and wolf warriors carved their legends into the bones of Europe, striking fear into hearts long before their axes touched flesh. And yet, like all things forged in violence, they vanished. Not suddenly, but slowly, piece by piece, until the stories of their frenzy turned from awe into warning. To understand why they disappeared is to understand how the world around them changed, and how the myths of power always fade when the ground beneath them shifts. The first and most profound change came not from the battlefield, but from belief itself. Christianity began to spread through the north, and with it came a new way of understanding the world. The old gods who had once filled berserkers with sacred fury were now cast as demons. What was once seen as divine possession became dangerous heresy. The rituals that had bound warriors to Odin's ecstasy were replaced with prayers to a god who preached humility and restraint. As churches rose where sacred groves once stood, the cultural foundation that had nurtured the berserkers' rage was dismantled. Their wild trance was no longer celebrated, it was feared. But belief alone didn't erase them. Law followed. As kingdoms consolidated power under Christian kings, the old warrior cults became a threat to order. Legal codes began to explicitly outlaw the berserker state. In Iceland's Gragas, a man who went berserk was declared an outlaw, stripped of protection under the law. Similar edicts spread across Scandinavia. A society that had once glorified the lone unstoppable fighter now demanded discipline and control. Rulers needed armies that could hold formations, obey commands, and fight as a single unit. A berserker lost in his own frenzy became a liability, dangerous to enemy and ally alike. Meanwhile, warfare itself evolved. Archery and organized cavalry changed the shape of the battlefield. Shield walls gave way to more disciplined tactics borrowed from the continent. Against ranks of trained soldiers, a lone berserker charging in blind fury was no longer terrifying. He was simply a target. Fire and steel cut down even the most frenzied warrior when discipline met chaos. What once gave the Vikings an edge now left them exposed. The very traits that made berserkers unstoppable in close combat became weaknesses in the face of ranged weapons and coordinated assaults. As the years passed, the cultural memory of these warriors shifted. Early sagas told of berserkers as heroes, sacred protectors of kings, men who stood beyond ordinary strength. But in later sagas, after Christianity and new legal orders had taken root, they became villains, troublemakers who disrupted the peace, brutish relics of a pagan age. The same frenzy that once inspired reverence was rewritten as madness, as something shameful. They were no longer living symbols of divine power. They were reminders of a past that no longer fit the new order. There is a quiet tragedy in their disappearance. They were not defeated in some final glorious battle. They were unmade by the slow turning of time, by the erosion of the world that had created them. Their skills, their altered states, their fearless way of being, they simply had no place in the age that followed. And yet, the loss feels larger than just the end of a warrior tradition. It feels like the closing of a door to something inside humanity itself. Because what were they really? Were they monsters, or were they proof of what the human mind and body can become when pushed to its furthest edge? They were men who accessed a part of themselves most of us will never touch, who shed the limits of fear and pain, who lived in a space between human and something beyond. When they vanished, did we lose more than just warrior? Did we lose a piece of human potential? A glimpse of what we might still be capable of if we dared to step outside the boundaries of comfort and control. It is easy to dismiss them as relics of a savage age, but even now their shadow lingers. The stories of their strength still spark a quiet curiosity. Could anyone today summon that kind of will, that kind of transcendence, or have we become too safe, too civilized, to even The berserkers and wolf warriors were products of a culture that embraced danger as a path to something greater. When that culture faded, so did they. Their disappearance was not just the end of an era, it was a sign of a world choosing order over chaos, law over legend, and stability over the terrifying possibility of becoming more than human. They slipped from history into myth, from flesh and blood warriors into stories whispered about the old day, and perhaps that is where they belong now, caught between fear and fascination, reminding us of the thin line between what we are and what we could become, what really happened inside a berserker's mind when the frenzy took hold. For centuries it was explained as magic, as a god entering the body, as a soul leaving the human world to become something other. But modern science offers a different lens, one that doesn't make these states less extraordinary, but perhaps even more fascinating, because what the berserkers accessed was not beyond human, it was deeply human, a raw and primal potential buried in all of us. When the body is pushed to the edge of survival, the brain changes. The rational part, the prefrontal cortex that governs planning, hesitation and fear, begins to quiet. In its place, deeper, older structures take over. The amygdala, the hypothalamus, the systems that have existed since our earliest ancestors, flood the body with chemical. Adrenaline surges first, sharpening reflexes and redirecting blood flow to the muscles. Heart rate rises, breathing quickens, pupils dilate to drink in every flicker of movement. In that moment, the body is no longer concerned with comfort or even pain. It is focused only on action. But adrenaline is just the beginning. Endorphins, the brain's natural painkillers, flood the nervous system, These compounds can dull even the deepest wounds, creating a kind of numbness that allows someone to keep moving long after they should have fallen. In extreme cases, this becomes what scientists call stress-induced analgesia, a state where injuries simply don't register until after the danger has passed. It explains how berserkers could keep fighting with deep cuts and broken bones, their frenzy seemingly unstoppable. To those who watched, it looked like invincibility. In reality, it was the body's emergency override system, pushed to its furthest limit. There's also a psychological shift. In high-stress moments, perception changes. Time can feel slower, movements feel instinctive, as if they are happening without conscious thought. Many modern soldiers and elite athletes describe this as a flow state, a moment when action feels effortless and perfectly aligned. The berserkers seem to live in that flow, but deeper, so deep that they lost the boundary between themselves and the battle. They didn't just act without hesitation, they became the act itself. It's not unique to them. We see glimpses of it in modern life. A firefighter lifting debris far heavier than they should be able to. A soldier in combat moving with inhuman speed. A mother lifting a car to save her child. In those moments, something primal awakens. The conscious mind steps aside, and the body becomes something more than it usually allows itself to be. Berserkers simply learned, through ritual and belief, to summon that state at will. There is also dissociation, a mental break that happens when the brain is overwhelmed. It's as if a part of you steps outside your own body, watching rather than feeling. Many combat veterans have described moments where they felt detached from themselves, acting almost automatically. This same detachment may have been at the heart of the berserker trance. By losing their sense of self, by abandoning the normal barriers of fear and pain, they could embrace a raw, animal state of being. To their enemies, it looked like possession. To science, it is the brain's extreme adaptation to trauma and danger. Training plays a role too. Elite modern soldiers don't just rely on strength or weapons. They rely on conditioning. Through relentless repetition, they rewire their reflexes until hesitation disappears. The berserkers trained themselves in similar ways. From childhood they were desensitized to pain, exposed to harsh cold, deprived of sleep, tested in rituals that stripped away the ordinary limits of the mind. This psychological conditioning, combined with cultural belief, created a pathway to the frenzy. They didn't stumble into it, they built it. When you think of it this way, the berserker state doesn't seem like an ancient mystery. It feels closer to something we all carry, because the same body chemistry that allowed them to bite shields and ignore blades still exists in us. It's the same system that kept our ancestors alive in a world full of predators. We've buried it under layers of comfort and civilization, but it hasn't disappeared. It waits for the right trigger. And that raises a question. Could you unlock it? Could you, with the right training, the right mindset, step into that same altered state? Modern science suggests the answer is yes, at least in part. Special forces units use controlled stress, exposure and breathing techniques to reach heightened combat readiness. Athletes use visualization and focus to enter flow state. In extreme sports, in survival situations, in life or death moments, the same ancient circuits fire, granting strength and clarity that feels superhuman. The difference is context. Today we access these states in rare, fleeting moments. For berserkers, it was a way of life. They built their entire identity around reaching that edge. They wrapped it in ritual, in myth, in the belief that Odin himself moved through them. That belief wasn't just decoration. It was the key that allowed them to surrender completely, to step out of their human selves and into something that felt beyond. So maybe the berserker trance was never sorcery. Maybe it was the most extreme form of what the human body is already capable of. That doesn't make it any less remarkable. In fact, it makes it even more haunting, because it means that inside every one of us lies a version of that same potential. It's not magic, it's biology, it's psychology, it's a door you could open, but one you might not easily close again. When we look back at these warriors, Through the lens of modern science, we see not just relics of a violent past, but a mirror to ourselves. We are not so different. We carry the same instincts, the same hidden reserves of strength, the same ability to become something else when survival demands it. The berserkers simply chose to live in that place where most of us visit only in moments of absolute crisis. And perhaps that's the real lesson. They were not gods, nor monsters, nor myths. They were human beings who learned how to reach deeper than most dare to go. They remind us that the line between ordinary and extraordinary is thinner than we think. The frenzy, the strength, the fearlessness, they are not lost to time. They are still within us, waiting, for better or worse, to be called upon. Even though the berserkers vanished from history, they never truly disappeared. They survived in stories, reshaped and retold, until their echoes found new life in places they could never have imagined. Today you can see their shadow everywhere, on the big screen, in the pages of fantasy novels, even in the avatars you control in video games. When you watch a character like Wolverine unleash a feral rage that makes him unstoppable, you're looking at a modern berserker. When Bjorn in Tolkien's tales transforms into a bear to protect his allies, it's the same ancient idea reborn. Video games have berserker modes that let players temporarily transcend normal limits, becoming faster, stronger, more dangerous, an interactive tribute to the same primal state those Viking warriors embraced on the battlefield. But the legacy isn't only in fiction, it's woven into the psychology of modern warriors, special forces soldiers, elite athletes, and even first responders, all trained to push past the limits of pain and fear, to enter heightened states of focus, where the impossible feels natural. Consider the Navy SEALs' infamous Hell Week. It's designed to strip away the ordinary self, to break the body and the mind, until only the essence of the warrior remains. Sleep deprivation, exposure to freezing water, relentless physical trials. These are modern versions of the same rituals that prepared young Vikings for the berserk trial. Both are about conditioning the body to withstand what would destroy most people, and conditioning the mind to operate beyond hesitation or doubt. It's tempting to think of the berserkers as primitive compared to the sophistication of today's military, but in many ways they were ahead of their time. They were, in a sense, the first human performance hackers. They found ways through ritual, belief and deliberate training to unlock altered states of consciousness. They learned how to shut off pain, how to bypass fear, how to draw on a reservoir of strength and focus that most people never touch. Modern neuroscience is only now catching up to explain what they did intuitively. We study stress hormones, endorphins and dissociation under a microscope, while they simply lived it, understanding through experience what the body and mind could become when pushed to their edge. This is where the line between history and now becomes blurry. We like to imagine we've evolved past them, but the truth is that we're still fascinated by what they achieved. Deep down, we recognize that the same capacity still exists within us. That's why movies, books and games keep returning to the idea of the warrior who transcends human limits. It speaks to something we all feel, that hidden potential waiting beneath the surface. When you watch a berserker-inspired character charge into impossible odds, you're seeing a reflection of the same question: what could you become if you shed your fear? Even in the military today, the language of elite units echoes the old way. There's talk of turning off the conscious mind, of reaching a flow state where action becomes instinct. Special operations forces practice controlled breathing, visualization and even exposure to extreme environments to reach a place of calm under chaos. These techniques aren't far removed from the isolation rituals and trance states described in the sagas. The tools have changed, but the goal is the same: to create a human being capable of more than what seems possible. It's not just about combat either. Athletes chase similar states. The sprinter who feels time slow down on the track, the climber who moves along a sheer cliff face with perfect calm, the musician who loses themselves so completely in a performance that they no longer feel separate from the music. All of them are touching the same edge that berserkers lived on. We call it flow or the zone, but it's the same human mechanism, a state where fear falls away, where pain becomes background noise, where the boundary between self and action dissolves. So when you see a berserker in a story, it's not just a relic of the past. It's a reminder of the continuum we're still part of. Those warriors weren't superhuman. They were simply willing to go further into the mind's hidden corridors than most of us dare. And the fact that their legend has lasted so long tells you how deeply their story resonates. We admire them, fear them, and wonder if we too could unlock that part of ourselves if the moment demanded it. Perhaps that's why their image keeps resurfacing. They represent a version of humanity we've buried under layers of comfort and rules, but haven't forgotten. They're the wild part of us that still remembers what it means to fight without restraint, to live without compromise, to touch that fleeting space where you become more than you thought you could be. Even in a world of advanced technology and organized armies, the core truths of human performance haven't changed. We still respond to the same stress hormones. We still have the same primal wiring. The berserkers knew how to harness it without science. And we, with all our knowledge, are still trying to rediscover it. That's why their legacy matters. Not just as entertainment, but as a reminder of what's possible. So the next time you see a character in a movie who can't be stopped, or you hear about a soldier enduring the impossible, think of those men on the misty shores of Lindisfarne, biting their shields, howling like animals, and charging without fear. They weren't just fighting battle, they were unlocking the deepest parts of what it means to be human. And maybe, just maybe, they're not as far from us as we think. Imagine standing on a muddy field, sword in hand, your breath sharp in the cold air. Across the distance they come. At first you hear only the rhythm of drums, and the clash of shields against shields. But then the sound changes into something you can't quite name, half a roar, half a howl. Through the mist, figures begin to emerge, moving faster than seems natural, their faces streaked with dark paint, their eyes wide and burning. One of them bites the rim of his shield until blood runs down his chin, and then he charges. Not cautiously, not with thought, but with a fury so complete it feels like nature itself has turned against you. Would you stand your ground, or would you rather it be silent? No drums, no roars, only the eerie stillness of waiting. The night is cold, the forest around you thick and black, and you hear it, a low howl, too close, then another from behind. It's not just one voice, it's many, circling you. You can't see them, but you know they're there, watching, waiting. Every shadow feels alive. You grip your spear tighter, but your hands are sweating. You tell yourself you're ready, but how do you fight what you cannot see? How do you defend against enemies who move like ghosts, who strike without warning and vanish back into the dark before you can even raise your weapon? Would you choose the storm or the hunt? To face the berserker is to face a force that doesn't care about life or death. He will rush through fire, through arrows, through blades, because pain means nothing to him. You can cut him, stab him, and he will keep coming until his body simply can't move anymore. He isn't thinking about survival. He isn't thinking about anything at all. He is pure motion, pure destruction. Fighting him feels like trying to stop a wave with your hand. One misstep and he's on you, a whirlwind of muscle and rage. But the wolf warriors are different. They won't charge at you blindly. They'll stalk you, test you, let you feel the pressure of being hunted. You'll hear them before you see them, and when you finally do, it's already too late. They'll attack from the shadows, coordinated and precise, cutting off every path of escape. They won't give you the satisfaction of a single heroic clash. They'll bleed you down slowly, a slash from the dark, a howl in the distance, until panic unravels you from the inside. Which terror is worse? The raw, unstoppable fury of the berserker, who feels no pain, no fear, and will not stop until one of you is dead, or the cold precision of the wolf warrior, who hunts you like prey and never lets you see the moment your doom is decided. One is chaos, overwhelming and immediate. The other is inevitability, patient and silent. Would you rather be swept away by the storm, or swallowed by the dark? Now imagine you're not alone. You're in a shield wall with your comrades. You want to believe you'll hold the line, that the weight of your numbers will matter. But then you see the berserker charging, screaming, eyes wide and wild, and you feel it, the hesitation. One man falters, then another. The line wavers before the first blow even lands. Or you're on patrol in the woods, telling yourself you're brave, but every shadow moves wrong, Every sound makes your heart jump. You start to imagine them everywhere. That's the power they carried. They didn't just fight you, they broke you before the fight even began. Could you resist that? Could you keep your mind clear as they closed in? Or would you, like so many before, feel your courage slipping, your grip loosening, your will to stand shattering under the weight of fear? It's easy to think you'd be different, that you'd hold your ground, but the men who ran weren't cowards. They were human, and against warriors who felt like something more than human, even the strongest cracked. So tell me, would you rather face the berserker's madness head on, knowing there's no reasoning, no retreat, only survival or death in the next few breaths? Or would you rather face the wolf warrior's silence, knowing you'll never see the strike until it's too late? Either way, the truth is the same. Against them you were never really in control, and maybe that's what made them truly terrifying. Not just their strength or their skill, but the way they made you realize how small you really were. The berserkers remind us of something unsettling, that the line between civilization and our most primal instincts is thinner than we like to believe. They were not born different from us. They were shaped by a world that demanded the absolute limits of body and mind. Their rituals, their beliefs, their training, all of it was designed to strip away the layers of hesitation and fear that we call human. And when those layers were gone, what remained was something raw, something we recognize but can hardly name. They weren't monsters. They were men who stepped outside the boundaries most of us never cross. It's easy to think we're far removed from them now, safe in our modern lives. But haven't you felt moments, however brief, when something deep and ancient stirred within you? That surge of adrenaline when danger strikes, that flash of clarity when fear should have paralyzed you but didn't. The berserkers lived in that state by choice. They made it their identity, and maybe that's why their story still grips. They are a mirror, showing us what we're capable of, and also what we might lose when we lock away those parts of ourselves. So as we leave the fog-covered shores of Viking raids behind, remember this: their terror wasn't just in their weapons or their frenzy, but in what they revealed about the human soul. Civilization is a fragile thing, and beneath it lies a depth we rarely touch. What would you become if your world demanded it? Would you cling to restraint, or would you awaken something you didn't know was there? In our next journey, we'll travel far from the frozen north to another warrior cult feared across continents, the Aztec Eagle Warrior. They too walked the edge between humanity and something more, but their purpose was bound not to survival, but to the gods who demanded sacrifice. Their story is different, yet no less haunting. Stay with me, because the next chapter takes us deeper into the minds of those who became living weapons. The berserkers leave us with a haunting reminder that beneath every layer of civilization, the primal self is still there. Wait, they were men who chose to cross that invisible threshold, to embrace a state of being most of us only glimpse in fleeting moments of crisis. And perhaps that's why their story stays with us. It satisfies something deep inside, a mix of fear and fascination, showing us how fragile the boundary between the human and the untamed really is. They lived at the edge of what we think is possible, and in doing so they showed us the raw truth of human potential. But even as we close this chapter on the most terrifying Viking warriors, the story doesn't end here, because across the ocean, in a world of sun-drenched temples and obsidian blades, there was another cult of warriors who pushed themselves beyond the ordinary. The Aztec Eagle Warrior. They weren't driven by frenzy or silent hunting. They fought for the gods themselves, binding blood, sacrifice and destiny into a code that terrified entire empires. What made them so feared, and what does their legacy reveal about the way humans have always sought power beyond the ordinary? That's what we'll uncover next. So before you go, take a moment to reflect. Would you rather live in the safety of the familiar, or would you dare to see what lies beyond your own limits? If this journey into the Viking mind has stirred something in you, share your thoughts in the comment. Which would you fear more, the storm of a berserker, or the silent hunt of a wolf warrior? And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next descent into the worlds of history's most extraordinary fight. Their stories aren't just about the past, they're about what still lives inside us all.